Sziasztok, and welcome back to the Hungarian Heritage Podcast, Season 4. It means so much to have you here with me again, and if this is your first time tuning in, I'm so glad that you're here. This podcast has always been a journey, not just through Hungarian people, places, food, and culture, but through the heart of what connects us all, our stories, our memories, and the pride we carry in who we are and where we come from. This season, I'll be introducing you to new friends and revisiting familiar voices who share a passion for preserving and celebrating Hungarian heritage. Together, we'll reflect on how traditions are preserved and how our Hungarian identity evolves and how we can pass this rich culture to the next generation so it doesn't just live in the past, but thrives in the future. Each episode will continue to reflect the flavors passed down through generations to the stories that carry our pride and history. Some stories will make you laugh, others might bring a tear to your eye, but all of them will reflect the beauty of what it means to be part of the Hungarian experience. I am filled with enthusiasm and honor to continue this journey with all of you as we connect the circles of Hungarians around us and make this community, Hungarian heritage, stronger than ever. Welcome to part 3 of my family's immigration story, found in the book Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. If you haven't listened to parts 1 or 2, you can certainly go back to those episodes before you begin this one. Why they didn't go back. 30 years of living in fear. Many are surprised to learn that my grandparents and father never returned to Hungary. Through my lens, it makes sense why they never returned. Their experience of leaving the country, home, and family during a time of political unrest, along with the fear of being accused of crimes against the state, was a very big deal. The communist regime remained in place until the late 1980s. At that time, it was 30 plus years of living life as an American, and also 30 years of living in fear that if they ever returned, my grandmother could still be persecuted for being on a list. There is a museum in Budapest on Andrássy út called the House of Terror, dedicated to the history of terror and torture of Hungarians that were under suspicion of being freedom fighters and sympathizers. Ironically, the museum is the very same building that my grandmother would have been taken to for questioning and possibly tortured had her friend and coworker not noticed her name at the top of the list in the boss's office. After visiting the House of Terror Museum in Budapest, I shudder to think what would have happened to my grandmother in that building had she not fled. I remember the day that Hungary was declared free, and I say that in quotes, free, when I was 19 years old. I told my grandmother, Hungary is free. Now we can go back and visit and I can meet the rest of the family. She replied that she could never go back because things don't change that quickly after a war or an occupation ends. The Hungarian people were fighting for the better part of 30 years under the communist regime. And as she stated, there will still be Hungarian people who sympathized and worked for the communists who would probably want to hurt me for being a sympathizer. My grandmother lamented. It was never really a conversation after that. Maybe she was wrong, but maybe she wasn't. Leaving her family in 1956 was hard enough, and the thought of returning for a visit to endure potential persecution from people who were still politically aligned with the communist regime was not an option for her or my grandfather. They started over in a new country, leaving their lives and families behind to provide a safe environment for themselves and my father. My grandparents considered themselves Americans. A letter thrown away, a family connection missed. The desire to visit Hungary was always burning in the back of my brain because half of my family was still there. With the heartbreak of having to leave, my grandparents never encouraged us to connect with the family they left behind. Everyone copes with heartbreak and trauma differently, and that's the way they coped. About 20 years ago, after my grandfather had already passed away, my grandmother received a letter from Hungary. I ran up the stairs with the unopened letter in hand, but she showed little emotion upon receiving it. It's not as if she never received mail from her family back in Hungary, but the communication had just stopped as her immediate family was getting older. The letter was from her sister Margit's grandson, which would be my second cousin. He had written his letter in Hungarian and also included a copy in English, as he wasn't sure which one my grandmother would better understand. Even though the letter was for my grandmother, it was the moment I had been desperately waiting for, a connection with my Hungarian family. At the time, I was busy juggling a young child and a baby and working as an English teacher, so when I asked my grandmother the next day if we were going to call him or write back, she answered with a resounding no. She had already thrown the letter away, and it had been taken away with the trash. All of my dreams of connection were instantly crushed, but it was the first time my grandmother shared with me the deep hurt that she felt inside and how hard it had been for her all those years not being able to return and then being too scared to return. Her voice cracked and tears fell from her eyes as she told me that she just wanted to leave the past in the past because it was too painful for her. I hugged her tightly and I told her that I completely understood and I would never speak of it again. Losing my Hungarian family in the U.S. without finding my family in Hungary. My grandfather, Imre István Obendorfer, died on September 1st, 1999. He had suffered through 2 bouts of cancer. The first round gave him an extra 5 years, and he was able to spend time with my daughter as a child. The second time, the cancer took his life. Before he died, he told me that my next child was going to be a boy and that he would watch over him. He was right, and he did. My grandmother, Gisela Ferenc Obendorfer, died on February 2nd, 2013. I woke up on the day of my 43rd birthday from a phone call with news of her passing from the assisted living facility where she spent the last year and a half of her life. Some may consider it somber that my birthday would be forever tarnished by memories of mourning my grandmother, but nothing could be further from the truth. It was very much her personality to make a mark on everything she did, and it was completely in her character to have passed away on my birthday so that I would always remember the day and remember her. Not that I could ever forget her. She was a heroine and a queen in my eyes. After the devastating loss of my grandparents, not only for me but for my children, the only silver lining on the horizon was that I was free to visit Hungary. Not that I did not have the autonomy or opportunity to do so prior to their passing, but I wasn't going to dishonor their lives, especially my grandmother's, and visit a place that she longed for but was too afraid to return to. A year and a half later, in 2014, after my grandmother had passed, my family made our first trip to Hungary. I was nervous with excitement when we landed in Budapest, as I had dreamed of this my entire life. We planned to do some sightseeing and visit the village of Detsk, where my grandmother grew up. We hired a guide to take us to the village, and I am not sure what we were looking to find, other than to see the village and feel the connection. We discussed in the car ride what we would say or what we would do when we met the person who answered the door at my great-grandparents' house. Even if there was a new family living in the house, maybe they would know something about the Ferenc family. When we arrived in Detsk, we were shocked to find that my grandmother's family home was gone. All that was left was the cement threshold where the house had been. Since we arrived in the village on Sunday morning, our next stop was the church in the center of the village, where my grandmother had attended since birth and where she and my grandfather were married. We pulled up just as the service was ending. Our presence caused an immediate commotion of interest as approximately 30 people, mostly nannies, surrounded us and were curious to find out what we were doing there. Our guide, Melinda, told them about who we were, and there was one elderly woman who remembered my grandmother and her family. We also found out that the remaining Ferenc family members had moved to Jönös 2 years prior because the family home was washed away when the creek behind my great-grandparents' house had flooded. The Ferenc family was gone, and so was what remained of their home. We then made a quick visit to the grave of my great-grandparents, and my daughter and I buried a picture of me and my grandmother below the surface of the dirt as a symbolic gesture. We made our way back to Budapest feeling fulfilled that we were able to visit Detsk, but with more questions that we hoped would one day be answered. We continued to sightsee for a few days, doing the typical things a first-time visitor would do. On our last day, we boarded our river cruise, and the boat was setting sail in the evening as the buildings and bridges were all lit up in the night sky. As the boat was slowly making its way under the famous chain bridge and then past the Parliament building, my husband received a phone call that my father had passed away. He had actually passed the day we were in Detsk, as if my grandparents had called him home to be with them. I was now an orphaned American Hungarian with no older living relatives in the United States and no family in Hungary with whom to connect. Reconnecting with my family and my Hungarian heritage. We visited Hungary many times since that first visit in 2014, and it was only 2 years ago that I finally made a successful connection with my family. Once again, that same second cousin, who mailed my grandmother a letter 20 years prior, sent an email trying to locate either my grandmother or her descendants, as there was a parcel of property that still had my grandmother's name on it in the village of Detsk. In Hungary, property is willed to a person's direct descendants unless otherwise specified. She was the last remaining point of contact regarding that parcel of land. On December 29th, 2023, my family and my second cousin's family, as well as his brother and his family, met for the first time, bringing the grandchildren of Gisela and Margit Ferenc together and reuniting the family that was tragically separated in the fall of 1956. Since then, we have remained connected over Zoom and have spent quality time visiting them in Hungary, and we are planning for them to visit us again this summer in the United States. What I have learned from my Hungarian family's immigration to the United States is strength and tenacity, and I have always used the situations they endured in their lives as benchmarks for the capacity to work through difficult times. I always remind myself that I can handle certain difficult situations because they are not as difficult as anything my grandparents or father endured. I remind myself that my grandmother hid in a barn and behind a headboard to avoid enemy troops moving through the village. I remind myself that my grandfather fought in a brutal war and spent time in a prisoner of war camp. I remind myself that my grandmother continued cooking dinner while consoling and hugging my 7-year-old father as he grasped onto her legs, begging her not to let him die, as they could hear the heavy explosions and artillery fire near their home during the 1956 uprising. I remind myself that my grandparents sacrificed their safety and their young son's safety to rely on a stranger to lead them to the border of Austria, as my grandmother had to escape persecution. I remind myself that my 7-year-old father endured walking quietly with weary legs past Russian troops in the dark to avoid being captured while en route to the border. I remind myself that my Hungarian family had to endure the refugee camp in Austria, another refugee camp in the U.S., and then start their entire lives over in a country where they did not speak the language. I remind myself about my family's Hungarian immigrant experiences when I need the courage to face any obstacle in life. I remind myself that no problem that I have ever had to solve was as hard as the things my grandparents and father had to endure. Their strength gives me strength. After visiting Hungary for the first time, we continue to visit often, and I have made my life's purpose to honor and reconnect with my Hungarian heritage by seeking ways to become more involved, from taking language classes to volunteering in the New Brunswick, New Jersey community. Over time, I have made new friendships and created exciting Hungarian opportunities for myself that continue to fulfill me on a personal and professional level. A decade ago, I never dreamed that I would be so involved with my Hungarian heritage, and I know that if I was able to talk to my grandmother right now, she would be so thrilled that I was finally able to feel the connection I have always longed for. We would probably have a good laugh and a long cry about all of the Hungarian things in which I am involved with, and I know she would be so proud of my tenacity to do so. After all, I learned it from her. Thanks for listening to part 3 of my family's immigration story found in Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. When I first sat down to write my family story, it was the first time I had taken all of the memories and stories in my head and organized them in a chronological archive of my family's experience. I remember that I had procrastinated. I knew the task ahead of me was going to be daunting in a sense of the amount of details I had been storing in my brain. I was unsure how I was going to narrow down all the stories and details into one that did not rival Homer's Odyssey, as this was my family's immigration odyssey. After much thinking during the procrastination period, I was finally able to sit down and let the words fall through my fingers as if my grandmother was retelling the information and I was the conduit. It had taken me less time than I anticipated as the words flowed through my head faster than my fingers could type on the laptop. It was both cathartic and surreal to reimagine those experiences that happened to my family, and recording them made me feel like I was honoring them by recounting their immigration experiences to be preserved alongside other people who also made the life-changing trek to America and other places during 1956. There are so many more stories and expanded details that could have been added to their story that is found in the volume. For example, my grandparents had tickets for a performance at the Hungarian Opera House on the evening they escaped. The vivid details of life and the people in the Austrian refugee camp, or the stories about their experiences adjusting and assimilating to life in America. There are so many more memories and stories that I will share, and having my family's immigration story included in Volume 2 of Hungarian Roots and American Dreams has been an inspiration for the importance of continuing to share those stories. One of the most important takeaways of my experience that I want to share with all of you is the importance of recording your family's stories and experiences for the generations to come. Knowing where your family came from and how they arrived in the United States is important, and those stories are important to share, no matter how recent or long ago that happened. It's simply not enough to just house the memories in your brain, because eventually those memories will disappear and the legacy of your family will be lost or reduced to names on a paper. I encourage you to start gathering your memories. Ask questions. Record the stories. Write them down. Archive them somewhere so your family and the future generations maintain their connection to their past. Make it more than just a family tree inscribed with names and dates. Include the stories, no matter how small. Most importantly, share them with your loved ones. My fingers are already poised above the keyboard for the next stories that are ready to be released and shared. I hope yours are too. Thanks for listening to parts 1, 2, and 3 of my family's immigration story. Stay tuned, because you never know when more stories will be coming your way. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. My story, along with many others, can be found in the book Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, and I will leave information in the show notes if you're interested in purchasing a copy in English or in Hungarian. If you have feedback or questions about this episode, or you would like to connect with me at the podcast, you will also find that information in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode and you're interested in learning more about this Hungarian heritage community, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Our theme music is Hungarian Dance by Pony Music, used with special license from Envato Market. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcast. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, make sure you stay Hungarian heritage strong. Sziasztok!